Hi, I'm Dr. Cassie from Vetfolio and the host of Vet2Vet. Today we're talking about pet food, something our clients ask us about all the time. Being able to make recommendations with confidence means it's important to know who is regulating the pet food industry and what do all of those stamps of approval really mean. Joining me today is fellow veterinarian Dr. Britannia Jones. Dr. Jones has a diverse professional background with experience in critical care, anesthesia, and of course, nutrition, and currently serves as the Director of Technical Veterinary Services for Blue Buffalo. Dr. Jones, thank you so much for being here with me today.
Well, thank you so much. I really am pleased to have this opportunity to talk to you.
Well, we're thrilled to have you. I know this was some information for me that really, I feel like didn't sink in until after I had already graduated vet school. So hopefully it'll be helpful out there for a lot of our colleagues as well.
I hope so. There's some great information for them to know, and there's some misinformation out there as well. So we'll see if we can clear up some of the confusion.
That sounds great. Well, let's go ahead and get into it. Of course, there's regulation in the pet food industry, but what role these individual agencies actually play might surprise people. So, can you give us a brief review of the regulatory bodies that are involved in the pet food industry?
Absolutely. I think first and foremost, since we are veterinary professionals here, to name the FDA, and as part of FDA, their Center for Veterinary Medicine, and they oversee, especially important for us, the role of the veterinary therapeutic diets, but also the manufacturing of the over-the-counter products. And they do this through inspections and ensuring good manufacturing practices are in place. And this agency is regulatory and it is enforcement. Then we've got AFCO. That's the other organization everybody's pretty familiar with, and that's the Association of American Feed Control Officials. Now, they're regulatory, but they are not enforcement. But what they do that is so important is they establish standards. So that includes definitions and policies for labeling, ingredients, the nutritional requirements for the life stages for dogs and cats. So a really important role there. Another organization you'll hear a lot is Wasaba, and that's the World Small Animal Veterinary Association. Again, it is not regulatory, but they are have a lot of influence on the pet food industry. And what they do that is so helpful is they provide guidelines for pet owners as well as veterinary professionals, that questions they can ask a pet food company in order for them to select a reputable company that they feel comfortable buying products from. And then on a more directly enforcement level are the state feed control officials. And they're the ones that are going out and testing retail products to make sure that the bag contains what it says it contains.
Sure. So, a lot of regulatory bodies involved here in different capacities. Let's break them down a little more specifically, starting with AFCO. Many of us have heard of AFCO, but what role more specifically do they play in the production of pet food?
Well, and they do so much. It's amazing how much they have accomplished and what they do on a regular basis. These are hardworking people. So they're made up of local, state, federal regulatory officials, and they meet periodically throughout the year. So they provide substance for the manufacturing of pet foods that include like minimum nutrient profiles for each life stage for dogs and cats. But they also are very key in establishing the ingredient standards. So they ensure that the ingredients we use are safe for dogs and cats. They also, of course, have policies in place for labeling. So they're trying to make labeling truthful and follow an established protocol for how information is utilized, what can be used, what cannot be used. So this is to help minimize the influence of marketing on ingredient panels, use of established ingredient names, validation of any claims that are made on the bag, and basically just give a true representation of the product. Then another really important aspect is they have established feeding trials for dogs and cats and for particular life stages in order to validate a nutritional adequacy statement. So, for instance, an adult maintenance feeding trial requires at least 8 healthy adult dogs or cats, depending on the product being fed, and the product is fed for a minimum of 26 weeks. Now, you can have more than 8, but regardless of how many animals you start with, um, at least 75% of the dogs have to successfully complete the feeding trial. So if you start with 8, 6 of them have to finish the trial. Um, Part of the evaluation of this is they're weighed weekly. There is an allowance for some change in body weight, and that's mostly because not all the dogs are going to find a diet palatable. So some of them may not be eating as much food just because it's not something they find particularly attractive. So it'll allow up to a 15% body weight variance by the end of the trial from the beginning of the trial. And then they also do some blood chemistries at the end, and they analyze 4 different blood parameters. But as you can tell, this is a pretty easy test to pass. You know, when you're starting with healthy adult animals who have, a good level, their blood chemistries are all good going into it. For only a 6-month feeding trial, a lot of nutritional deficiencies won't show up at that time. So it's kind of a low bar right now, but AFCO is looking into those to see what modifications they can make to make it more accurately reflect the quality of the diet. And of course, we do have feeding trials for growth and for gestation lactation. Those are a lot harder to pass. So those, I feel good are really rigorous feeding trials that reflect the success of the diets. And remember, though, this is something that's very common, is people seem to think that there's some sort of an approval, an AFCO approval or an AFCO certification, and that is not the case. There's absolutely no such thing as AFCO approval or AFCO certification.
And of course, kind of the opposite of this feeding trial is formulated. What exactly does it mean for a diet to be formulated versus feeding trial tested?
That's a great question. Since AFCO establishes the minimum nutrient requirements for each life stage, the nutritionists that formulate diets and who have intensive knowledge in the ingredients and the analyses for each of those, they can put in the nutritional adequacy statement that the diet is formulated to meet the minimum nutrient levels identified by AFCO for a specific life stage. And then, of course, the feeding trials is another way to validate. A third way that is not real commonly used is what they call a family product claim. So if you have a diet that's formulated, you put it through a feeding trial and it passes, and then they modify the diet somewhat to create a new product. That new product can then, on the nutritional adequacy statement, say that it fits in this family claim that was established by the parent formula for feeding trial appropriation. So now I will say an important development by AFCO in the last few years is that they have established a specific nutrient profile for large breed puppies. So what we have found over time is that with large breed puppies, their need for calcium is a much tighter range than what's been recognized before. So for instance, a large breed puppy is for any dog that's going to be over 70 pounds as a mature animal. So that takes in large breed and giant breed puppies. But their calcium needs are like 1.2 to a 1.8 on a dry matter basis. That is a really tight range. And to give you an example with the small breed puppies, their calcium range is 1.2 to 2.5. That's a significant difference. So if the diet is appropriate for large breed puppies, they have to state that very clearly on the nutritional adequacy statement. And if it does not meet that tight calcium control, it also has to state that it's not for large breed puppies. So that's something new that has just come up in the last few years.
I love that you bring up the large breed puppies because of course that's near and dear to my heart. I'm a lab person, so a lot of large breeds, and I worry a lot about hips and joints. And so that's good to know that there's some tight regulation on those diets.
Well, and it means a lot to me too, because I have my 5th Great Dane
Oh
now.
my goodness.
Yes, and my guy here, Winston, he's about 150 pounds. He's very lean. He's 3 years old, but you're very mindful of this when they're growing, because if we don't pay attention to that, they can have some real serious developmental issues.
Oh my god. And Winston is like the perfect name for a Great Dane. I love it.
I have to say, some of the faces he makes in the pictures, you know why he's named Winston. It's hilarious.
All right. I'm going to plan on seeing some of those pictures after we get done with all of this. So on that same note, we're talking about life stages. We talked about growth and lactation. What about mature adult or senior diets?
And I'm so glad you asked that. You know, AFCO at this time does not recognize a separate life stage for mature or senior animals. And I think it's because there have not been studies that have very clearly identified different nutrient needs for those older pets. So, yeah, you're not going to see that requirement or specific nutrient profiles for our senior pets.
Another agency that we touched on briefly is Wasaba, and you mentioned that they provide these guidelines. Can you elaborate a little bit more on Wasaba's role in the pet food industry?
Absolutely. You know, they have recognized one thing, that it's very hard to assess the pet food company that you're either currently buying food from or are considering to purchase food from, to know exactly what they're doing to make sure the food is safe, you know, who's formulating the diets. So Wasaba came up with these guidelines for, you know, and made it very simple for somebody to call the company and say, hey, I'm just wondering, can you give me the answers to these questions? So the questions look at, like I said, who is formulating the diets? Do they have nutritionists or a boarded veterinary nutritionist? Who, you know, do they have other food experts on board? They're also looking at, you know, what's your quality of incoming ingredients? You know, what's your quality control for meeting your specifications, or for making that sure that nothing gets into the food during manufacturing that shouldn't be there. So, you know, what kind of checks and balances do you have in place during your manufacturing procedure? Anytime you're using specific equipment like extruders or a retort, which does canning, the nutrition that is in the raw ingredients are affected just by the way that they're manufactured and processed. So you want to make sure that whoever's doing that processing and the formulators know that there's going to be a certain impact, say on the antioxidant levels or the vitamin levels, according to the type of processing going on, and that they plan accordingly so the end product is what it's supposed to be. Shelf life testing is really important to make sure that the product, you know, is going to be good for as long as the manufacturer says it's going to. But just continuous monitoring in the laboratories that these companies have in-house for all stages of manufacturing. Again, just to make sure that the product is what it says it is on the outside of that bag, and the owners have confidence that it has been safely and accurately made.
Sure. I remember in vet school talking about whatever food you're feeding, you should be able to pick up the phone and get a hold of somebody who can answer all of these questions for you.
Exactly.
And that kind of segues perfectly into our next topic of discussion, because we've gone a lot into the external bodies guiding and regulating pet food and what role they play, or more importantly, what role they don't play. Let's talk a little bit more about internal regulation. Like you said, it doesn't take much for an adult maintenance diet to pass AFCO standards. So what kind of additional research and quality controls are going into or should go into creating a quality pet food?
Oh, and that's such a great question, Cassie, because there is so much. A real common one, I think, what most people would expect is microbial testing. You know, when you're using raw ingredients, especially um, meat sources, there's a risk that potential contamination for like salmonella or listeria or E. coli. So microbial testing is ongoing, it's constant, whether it's getting that ingredient from the supplier and all the various steps to manufacturing to the finished product. It's so key. But also things like aflatoxin. We know that historically this has been an issue and it's caused some animals to be sick. So, you know, screening ingredients when they come to your plant, but you're also counting on the screening that your vendors are doing and that they're doing screening from where they buy the product or the crops right out of the field. So there's everybody in the pathway of developing a pet food has to be screening for that to make sure that we don't have another aflatoxin recall. Melamine screening, you know, for those of us who have been veterinarians for a long time, we will remember the 2007 recall for melamine. So those, all of the vegetable source proteins are screened routinely. You never let up on that. Vitamin premix, we know that we've had recalls where a mistake has been made and there's been too high a level of vitamin D.
Mhm.
So vitamin premixes, you know, just because you buy it from your vendor doesn't mean that you can have blind trust that it's always going to be what it says it can be, because mistakes happen. So monitoring that. Another one that sounds a little simple, but the moisture testing, especially in dry foods. And this is because, you know, a product can be perfect at the end of production, but if the moisture content is over 10%, say 12%, that product's great at that time. But say it goes to a warehouse for a couple months before it goes out to the retail establishment, that moisture is just high enough that it could cause that product to start getting moldy. So it sounds really simple, but it's really important. You know, it's not necessarily going to make an animal sick, but who wants to open up a bag of pet food and see mold in there? You sure don't want that. And then finally, we just, you know, make darn sure that the nutrient levels are what they're supposed to be for that particular product. So as you can tell, there's a lot of internal checking and rechecking. You know, the pet food manufacturers take this very seriously.
Sure. And can you give us an example of the influence of these quality controls on the final product?
Absolutely. So, you know, and it kind of gets into that recall topic, in that when things slip through or the protocols that are in place have not been followed. So we kind of talked about the aflatoxin situation, and that was just somebody was not doing their job, and it ended up, you know, making a lot of animals sick. So typically product is held, I know for us, our product is held until we get all of our testing back and it says, hey, the product's good to go, ship it, you know. But again, we're human. Sometimes things happen and a product will be released before some, you know, a recheck comes in. And two, sometimes in the veterinary world, the first you know that there's a problem is somebody's animal gets sick. So while all the checks and balances are in place, sometimes things don't go the way you hope it is. And so the recalls is another way in which it's kind of a, if been a problem identified, we try to make sure that that product is, you know, comes back or is not getting as far as the pet owner's household. And we, you know, there are no sick animals as a result of that.
And I love that you brought up aflatoxin because we have seen that periodically, and it talks perfectly about recalls. You know, recalls, they sound like a scary thing, but like you mentioned, with all these internal controls, it's important to recognize the difference between a voluntary recall that's based on a problem that was noted internally versus an externally mandated recall. Can you elaborate a bit on the differences between those for us?
I'm so glad that you asked about that because this is really important. And you're right. You know, probably 98% of recalls are voluntary on the action of the manufacturer who have identified that, oh, we might have a potential problem. Usually, that no animals have been sickened because of it. It's just an overabundance of caution that's like, we didn't like this result. We don't want to take a chance. We're going to put a recall out there. But you're also right that FDA can step in and say, hey, this is really serious business. They generally will give the company the opportunity to step up and do what's right. But if the company doesn't, they're more than ready to step in and say, hey, and matter of fact, for the very first time in March of this year, they put an order out on a company that they cannot make any more product, they can't distribute it, they can't sell it, they can't do anything because they've had so many issues. So that was a first that we saw in FDA. But FDA they have different categories of recalls. So depending on the type of recall, it gives you a lot of information. So class 1 is the most serious. And with that, it's recognized that that product is defective and it's dangerous and it could predictably cause serious health effects. So for those of us who are old enough, we remember melamine. That was a class 1 recall. Now the class 2, the products might cause a temporary health issue, or it's perceived as a slight threat of a serious nature. And what comes to mind with that is like a lot of times with canned cat food, because heat destroys thiamine, we end up with a cat product that is too low in thiamine. So it might cause an issue. And if it does, it's treatable. We can reverse the effects of it, but it's recall, obviously, it's not an acceptable product. And then class 3 is the most mild of them. And this is where FDA recognizes that products are not likely to cause an issue, or cause any adverse health events, but they do violate the FDA policy. So this would be a packaging problem, or like that moisture content being higher than it should, where it may cause moldy product down the road. So that would be a class 1 recall. So, and like I said, FDA generally gives the manufacturer the opportunity to step up and do everything they should do. But if that's not the case, they will step in and make sure that that protection is in place.
Man, that just kind of gets my hackles up a little bit to know that there were so many recalls that the FDA had to step in and stop them from manufacturing pet food. I'm going, these poor animals.
Yeah. And you figure as long as we've been making pet food, gosh, we're probably running on more than 80 years now for the most common brands that we see out there. And for this to have been the very first time that they had to shut down a manufacturer and say, you can't make it, you can't sell it, you can't distribute it, you are done until you get your act cleaned up. So that was a surprising development, no doubt about it. But I'm really thankful that they're there and that these are actions that can be taken. We all have pets. The last thing anybody wants is for a pet to be sick.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So thank goodness for all of the internal controls and the external controls helping to keep our pets safe. Dr. Jones, this has been great information. Thank you so much for joining me and for giving us all of this great information so we can take it forward and not only be educated ourselves, but help relay some of this information in helping pet owners understand pet food and choosing a good quality food for their pet.
Well, thank you so much, Cassie, for the opportunity to share this information with you. And you know what? It's never a bad idea just to refresh your knowledge on it.
Right.
Because it bears repeating, and we have to educate our pet owners.
Absolutely. Well, again, this has been great. I want to say thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Cassie. It's been a real pleasure.
And thank you to Blue Buffalo for sponsoring this edition of Vet2Vet. Check out the Spark section of vetfolio.com for more of our V2V discussions on various topics in veterinary medicine. And remember, if one animal is better off because of you today, it's a great day.